On the morning of September 14, 1997, a cable arrived at Hereford. It came through Defense Secretariat 5, the protocol channel for instructions that require no secondary verification or committee approval. It had been encrypted and decrypted through secure military channels. The message was direct and unambiguous. The SAS was to withdraw all operational elements from East Timor within 14 days. All personnel were to be extracted. All operations were to cease. All liaison arrangements were to be terminated. No personnel extensions, no mission continuation, no further operations in the territory. The authority was ministerial. The deadline was absolute. No extensions would be granted. Whitehall had made its decision. The Foreign Office had consulted with the MOD. The matter had been discussed in the Joint Intelligence Committee. The Defense Secretary had signed off. The decision had been made in a room with wood paneling and filtered light, and it was final. The cable was marked with the appropriate classification markings. It carried all the formal authority of the British state. It was the kind of message that military organizations obey without question. Officers are trained to obey such messages. The hierarchy of command demands it. The culture of the military institution requires it. Careers depend on it. The cable sat in the command center for 6 hours before anyone responded. It sat on desks. It was read and reread. It was discussed. It was analyzed. When the response finally came, it was brief and minimal. It acknowledged receipt of the message. It contained no timeline for implementation of the withdrawal. It contained no discussion of the tactical situation on the ground. It contained no list of personnel to be extracted or their current locations. It contained no request for clarification or discussion of the terms. It simply stated that the message was noted. That was all. The signature came from the commanding officer of 22 SAS Regiment. Below it, there was nothing else. No subordinate signatures, no acknowledgement from the operations officer, no confirmation from logistics, no indication that the orders would be followed in the manner prescribed. The reply seemed to suggest that someone had read the message and then decided that no further response was actually necessary at all. It was a signal. It was a message wrapped inside another message. It was a statement made by silence. It said more by not saying anything than any detailed response could have conveyed. What Whitehall did not understand, what the Foreign Office did not grasp, what the Defense Secretary had not calculated, was that the SAS had already begun the process of withdrawal 3 days before the cable arrived. The decision had been made not by the commanding officer in consultation with his chain of command, not by committee, not by consensus, but by the small group of officers who understood the situation in East Timor in real time. They knew what was happening. They knew what was about to happen. They understood the indicators. They understood the pattern. They had seen it before in other places, other times, other conflicts. The intelligence assessment had shifted dramatically in the previous 72 hours. What had begun as a stabilization operation in support of the UN referendum had evolved into something else entirely, something darker, something more dangerous. Indonesian military elements that were supposed to be neutral, supposedly impartial supervisors of the referendum process, had become actively hostile to British personnel. Specific threats had been identified. Specific militia groups had been observed making preparations to move against foreign military observers. The risk profile had changed from moderate to extreme. The calculation had shifted. The calculus of risk versus benefit had shifted fundamentally. And so, without waiting for Whitehall to think through the implications, without waiting for the bureaucratic machinery to process the information, without waiting for permission, the SAS had begun moving their people out through channels that would not attract attention from the diplomatic cables or the official channels of communication that connected the British mission in Dili to the Foreign Office in London. The decision had been made by the men on the ground. It had been made based on information that London did not yet have. It had been made based on the judgment of military professionals who understood that some decisions cannot wait. The men who were coming out had been embedded with the United Nations Assistance Mission in East Timor, formerly designated as UNMOSET. They were there officially as military observers, providing security assessment and threat evaluation to the UN command structure. They filed reports about security concerns. They participated in briefings. They attended UN meetings. They were visible, they were part of the structure. They were there unofficially as intelligence gatherers, monitoring Indonesian military activity at a level of detail that the Foreign Office did not wish to acknowledge in writing, that the Ministry of Defense preferred not to admit existed, that political leadership found inconvenient and complicated and problematic. Their presence was deniable. Their intelligence was not. They had been filing reports on specific locations where Indonesian military units were organizing militia groups. They had been noting dates, times, vehicle registrations, and personnel movements. They had identified facilities where weapons were being distributed to civilian militias. They had documented evidence of a coordinated campaign of violence that was being organized at high levels of the Indonesian military hierarchy. They had names, ranks, unit designations, and command chains. They had physical evidence that could be photographed. They had intercepts that could be recorded. They had eyewitness accounts that could be verified. They had been doing this work for weeks, watching, recording, documenting everything. The intelligence they had gathered in the weeks before the referendum was comprehensive and precise. The SAS observers had noted the movement of weapons into the territory in the weeks leading up to the vote. They had identified specific barracks where the pro-integration militia were being trained by officers from the Indonesian Special Forces Command, known as Kopassus. They had documented the involvement of regular Indonesian military officers in the organization of violence. They had seen weapons being transported in military vehicles with military markings, weapons that were supposed to be under lock and key, weapons that were being moved deliberately into militia hands. They had observed Indonesian military personnel in command positions directing militia organization activities. They had photographed evidence of coordination between military and civilian administrative structures. They had traced funding flows from military accounts to militia organizations. They had identified supply lines from military warehouses to civilian militia storage facilities. None of this was speculation. All of it was grounded in observation and documentation. And all of it was being reported through intelligence channels to London. The reports were specific. They identified individuals. They named units. They provided dates and times. They provided vehicle registration numbers and facility locations. They provided names of officers and descriptions of equipment. The intelligence assessment being compiled by the British intelligence community was clear and unambiguous. The Indonesian military was planning a systematic campaign of violence against the pro-independence movement and the population that supported them. The campaign would begin after the referendum vote. It would be extensive. It would be coordinated. It would achieve its objectives. It would involve the use of civilian militias as the primary instrument, with Indonesian military units providing training, equipment, coordination, and if necessary, direct intervention. The goal was to suppress the independence movement and to ensure that the pro-integration side prevailed, or if it did not prevail, to make the independence victory sufficiently costly in human terms that it could be portrayed as a failure of UN administration. The intelligence indicated that specific officers within the Indonesian military hierarchy had already decided on this course of action. The officers had names, they held positions, they had authority, they had resources, and they had made their intentions clear to the regional commanders and militia leaders. The intention was not a possibility. It was a decision. It was a plan. The assessment also included a detailed calculation of risk to British personnel. If the violence began and escalated as the intelligence suggested it would, British military personnel in the territory would be at significant risk. They could be targeted by militia groups seeking to strike at foreign observers. They could be caught up in the violence as civilians attempted to flee. They could be deliberately eliminated by Indonesian military units seeking to eliminate evidence of their coordination with the militias. The assessment concluded that the risk had moved from manageable to unacceptable. The decision to withdraw was therefore not simply a matter of political preference. It was a matter of personnel safety. It was a matter of protecting British lives. The assessment was explicit about this. The risk assessment was unambiguous. What they were documenting was a situation that Whitehall preferred to manage diplomatically. The Australian government was moving in its own direction, increasingly concerned about the scale of violence and the credibility of the UN operation. The Americans were making their own assessments, and those assessments were leading them toward a conclusion that was fundamentally at odds with the British position. The British government had been trying to maintain a middle position, a moderate approach, a carefully balanced posture. Intelligence was useful, public involvement was not. The SAS presence was valuable precisely because it was not visible, not acknowledged, not something that could be thrown up in the House of Commons by a backbencher with a constituency interest in human rights. And so the Foreign Office had decided that the operation should be concluded. The timeline was short. The decision was made without consultation of the military hierarchy below the level of the Defense Secretary's office. The Foreign Secretary was consulted, but the process was brief. The decision was made in principle by the political leadership. It was communicated to the Defense Secretary. The Defense Secretary passed it to the MOD. The MOD prepared the cable. The cable was sent, and by that time the withdrawal was already underway. But the withdrawal, however, was already well underway before that decision was communicated through official channels. The field commanders in East Timor had been monitoring the same intelligence indicators that London was receiving. They had access to the same reports from Australian intelligence services. They had access to the same assessments from their own sources, their own networks, their own observations, and they had come to the same conclusion that London was beginning to reach, but they had reached it faster. The situation was deteriorating. The risk was increasing exponentially. The time to withdraw was now. The time had already come. The first element had come out on September 11th. That was 3 men. They had walked out through the UN checkpoint in the center of Dili and simply ceased to exist as far as the UNMOSET operation was concerned. They were no longer on the manifest. They were no longer accounted for in the daily reports. They were no longer present. Their absence was noted only by the fact that they had signed out on a departure manifest that listed them as returning to their home countries on personal leave. It was a clean exit. It left no trace. No one asked questions about 3 military observers leaving early. There were always people leaving early. The second element came out on September 12th. That was 5 men. They moved through the airport at night and departed on a C-130 flight that was never listed in any manifest that would be accessible to journalists or parliamentary researchers. The timing was such that they departed during the shift change at the airport terminal, when the security personnel were less vigilant, when attention was focused elsewhere. The C-130 had been arranged to depart anyway as part of routine UN logistics operations, so their departure did not require any special arrangements that might have drawn attention. They simply blended into the routine movement of people through the airport. They wore civilian clothes. They carried standard luggage. They moved like any other passenger. They spoke in low voices. They did not draw attention. The third element came out on September 13th. That was 6 men. They used the same technique. They walked out during a period when the checkpoints were busy. They boarded a transport flight that was already scheduled to depart. By the time the cable arrived on September 14th, there were only 4 men left on the ground, and those 4 men were scheduled to come out within the next 36 hours. The silence from Hereford in response to Whitehall's 14-day deadline was not insubordination in any formal sense. It was something more subtle and more complete than that. It was an indication that the decision had already been implemented. It was a way of saying that the question was no longer relevant because the situation it addressed had already been resolved. Whitehall believed it was giving orders to an organization that would then have to go through the tedious process of extraction, logistics, coordination with other elements of the military establishment, consultation with the UN mission, and notification of the personnel involved. Hereford was indicating that all of that had already been done. The operation was complete. The withdrawal was accomplished. The response was essentially a notification that the instructions, while appreciated, were addressing a situation that no longer existed in any practical sense. The message from Hereford said that Whitehall's deadline had already been met. It said that the operation was done. It said that the matter was closed. By September 16th, the last 4 men were out. They had moved through a secondary checkpoint that had been arranged through a liaison officer at the UN mission. The liaison officer had no idea that the men he was processing were actually the last members of an intelligence operation that had been generating significant material on Indonesian military command and control structures. As far as he was concerned, he was simply processing some British military personnel who had decided to leave early. The paperwork was routine. The departure was unremarkable. Within 72 hours of Whitehall's deadline, every single SAS element in East Timor had been extracted. Not a single person remained. Not a single piece of equipment was left behind. The operation had been completely and comprehensively closed down. The facilities that had been used were cleaned, the safe houses were vacated, the liaison networks were severed. The operation simply ceased to exist as though it had never been. The traces were covered, the records were archived, everything was finished. The intelligence they had gathered went into a classified assessment that was circulated to a limited distribution list that included the Defense Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, the Chief of Defense Staff, and the director of MI6. The assessment concluded that the violence that was about to unfold in East Timor had been organized, coordinated, and was directly traceable to specific Indonesian military command structures. The assessment named names, it identified units, it provided evidence of the involvement of officers who held significant positions in the military hierarchy. The assessment was accurate in every particular. 3 weeks after the last SAS operator left the country, the Indonesian military orchestrated a campaign of violence that would leave over 1,000 people dead. Entire villages were massacred, churches were burned, neighborhoods were systematically destroyed. The UN mission, which had been supposed to observe the referendum and ensure its integrity, instead found itself in the middle of a humanitarian catastrophe that it had no resources to address. The violence was worse than anything the intelligence had predicted. The scale exceeded even the darkest assessments. The violence that came was exactly as the intelligence had predicted. It came when it was predicted. It targeted who it was predicted to target. The militias that had been identified in the intelligence assessments were the ones that carried out the violence. The weapons that had been tracked through the supply chain were the ones that were used. The military officers who had been named in the intelligence assessments were the ones who coordinated the campaigns. Every element of the prediction had been accurate. The question that hung over the government was whether the government could have done something to prevent it if the intelligence had been acted upon differently. But that was not a question anyone in government wanted to ask. That question never made it into official records. The Australian government, which had access to different intelligence and different perspectives, decided that it would intervene with its own military forces. That decision was not made in isolation. The Australian decision was informed by the assessments of the intelligence community, which included the reports and analysis that had been generated by SAS personnel before they were extracted. The British government, having received the same intelligence, made a different decision. It would not intervene. It would manage the situation through diplomatic channels. It would express concern and call for restraint. It would do everything except what the situation actually required. And so the responsibility for action fell to Australia, to the UN, and eventually to the global media, which finally forced governments to acknowledge what their intelligence services had known for weeks. The media reported what the government would not admit. The 14-day deadline from Whitehall proved to be entirely irrelevant to the actual course of events. The operation that Whitehall believed it was ordering to be shut down was already shut down before the order arrived. The organization that Whitehall believed was receiving instructions to withdraw was already in the process of its withdrawal. The request for a 14-day timeline was a request for a process that had been completed in a different time frame, using a different decision-making structure, and with a completeness that Whitehall had not imagined was possible. What had happened was not a case of military disobedience or insubordination in any conventional sense. It was a case of the military hierarchy making decisions faster and with better information than the civilian hierarchy could process. It was a case of the military understanding the situation more clearly than the politicians. The lack of response from Hereford was therefore not a silence of defiance or resistance. It was a silence of completion. It was a way of indicating that the question had been superseded by reality. Whitehall had made its decision based on one set of circumstances and one timeline. The SAS had made its decision based on a different set of circumstances and a different timeline. Both decisions pointed in the same direction. Both decisions resulted in withdrawal. The difference was that the SAS had already finished while Whitehall was still writing the orders. The military had moved before the civilians could formulate the policy. What emerged from this sequence of events was a question about the nature of command and control in military operations that are conducted in an intelligence context. When does a field commander make decisions that should be made by the civilian hierarchy? When is the field commander in a better position to assess the situation than the civilian hierarchy? When is speed more important than consultation? And what happens when an organization that is trained to operate in conditions of ambiguity and incomplete information encounters a civilian hierarchy that moves much more slowly and requires much more certainty before making decisions? These questions had no official answers. The question was deliberately not asked. In this case, the answer was that the field commander, operating with perfect knowledge of the situation on the ground, and with an understanding of the tactical and strategic implications of continued presence, simply made the decision that the civilian hierarchy was going to make anyway. He made it faster, he made it more completely, and he made it with the confidence that comes from being responsible for the lives of the men under his command. The civilian hierarchy, when it eventually arrived at the same decision, found that it had been anticipated. The machinery of state had been outpaced by the judgment of military officers who understood that some decisions cannot wait for committee meetings and interdepartmental coordination. They understood that some decisions require action before they require approval. They understood that sometimes the best way to demonstrate your competence is to make the hard decision before you are ordered to make it. The cable from Whitehall was filed in the archives. The response from Hereford was also filed, but the operation itself, the extraction of intelligence personnel from a country that was about to become a zone of intense violence, had been completed according to a timeline that did not match either the civilian deadline or the military response. It had been completed according to the timeline demanded by the situation itself. And when the situation finally became public, when the violence in East Timor became impossible to ignore, Whitehall discovered that its own intelligence services had already provided it with the information it needed to make the right decision. The problem was not that it had not received the intelligence. The problem was that it had received it and decided that the diplomatic approach was more important than the military intervention. The SAS, by extracting its personnel before it was ordered to do so, had already cast its vote on that question without needing to say anything at all. The action spoke louder than any words could have spoken. The pattern that emerged from this operation would become familiar over the next 2 decades. When the military had better information than the civilian hierarchy, and when the stakes were high enough, the military would make the decision. It would not ask for permission. It would not wait for authorization. It would simply do what it believed was necessary to protect its personnel and to preserve the integrity of its operation. This was not a matter of military government or military coup. It was a matter of organizations with different information, different timelines, and different responsibilities reaching the same conclusion through different paths. And it was a matter of the civilian hierarchy discovering, after the fact, that the military had already resolved the problem that the civilian hierarchy was still trying to frame as a question. The action was complete before the policy was written. The response from Hereford was not defiance. It was a statement. It said that the matter had been handled. It said that the decision had been made. It said that the operation was complete. It said implicitly that the civilian leadership could now make whatever policy decision it wanted to make. But the operation would not be affected by that decision because the operation was already finished. The cable from the Foreign Office arrived too late. The decision had already been made. The extraction had already been accomplished. The withdrawal had already been completed. The civilian leadership had been outpaced by the military professionals who understood what needed to be done and when it needed to be done. The intelligence assessments that had been prepared before the withdrawal were circulated to a limited audience. They were marked as classified at the highest levels. They contained information that was considered sensitive. They predicted violence. They identified specific perpetrators. They explained the mechanisms by which the violence would be executed. And they explained in detail why British military personnel needed to be withdrawn immediately. The assessment was written in the language of intelligence analysis. It was objective. It was supported by evidence. It was thorough, and it was completely accurate in every particular. What happened in East Timor in the weeks following the referendum confirmed every prediction that had been made in the intelligence assessment. The violence began on the date that had been predicted. It targeted the populations that had been predicted to be at risk. The militias that had been identified by name carried out the violence. The military officers who had been named in the assessment provided coordination and support. The weapons that had been tracked through the intelligence operation were used. The facilities that had been identified as militia bases became sites of atrocities. Everything that the intelligence operation had predicted came to pass, and the intelligence operation had been completed, and the personnel had been extracted 3 weeks before any of it happened. The cable from Whitehall was clear. The order was unambiguous. The deadline was absolute. But the order arrived at a moment when the organization that was supposed to execute it had already executed it. The cable was like a train order delivered after the train had already departed. It was like an instruction to close a door that was already closed. The instruction was unnecessary because the action had already been taken. The deadline was met not on the schedule prescribed by the deadline, but on the schedule demanded by the situation on the ground. This was not unique to the SAS. This was not unique to this operation. This was a recurring pattern in military organizations. When field commanders have better information than civilian leadership, they make decisions based on that information. When the risk is high and the civilian hierarchy is slow, the military makes the decision without waiting for authorization. When the stakes involve the lives of military personnel, the military hierarchy prioritizes the safety of its people over the niceties of command and control. This is not officially acknowledged. This is not taught in military academies as a doctrine. This is not written down in regulations or policy documents. But it happens. It has happened repeatedly. And it will continue to happen as long as military organizations exist and as long as they have better information than the civilian hierarchy that they are supposed to serve. The significance of the response from Hereford is that it was not a response at all. It was a notification. It was a statement that the matter had been handled and that further communication on the subject was not necessary. The silence that followed was not a refusal to obey the order. It was a notification that the order had been superseded by events. The order would have been obeyed. The withdrawal would have been executed, but it had already been executed. The military did not disobey the order. It simply completed the order before the order was given, and then it notified the civilian leadership that the order had been completed. What Whitehall learned from this incident, if it learned anything at all, was never formally articulated. There were no policy reviews. There were no investigations. There were no official discussions of the implications. The matter was handled as a routine operational matter. The order was given. The operation was completed. The matter was closed. But in the closed meetings of senior officials, in the private conversations between military and civilian leaders, in the intelligence briefings that are classified at the highest levels, the question hung in the air: what does it mean for civilian control of the military when the military makes decisions faster than the civilian leadership can make them? What does it mean when the military has better information than the civilian leadership? What does it mean when the military decides that the risk is too high and that it cannot wait for the civilian leadership to reach the same conclusion? The answer was that it meant that the relationship between civilian and military authority was more complicated than the formal structure suggested. The official doctrine was that the military takes orders from the civilian leadership. The reality was that the military also makes decisions that the civilian leadership is only informed about after the fact. The official structure is hierarchical. The actual structure is more fluid. The military makes recommendations, the civilian leadership makes decisions, but sometimes the military makes the decision first. Sometimes the military presents the civilian leadership with a fait accompli. And sometimes the civilian leadership discovers that it has been outpaced by the organization that it was supposed to be commanding. This is not something that is discussed openly. This is not something that military officers admit in testimony to Parliament. This is not something that appears in the official histories, but it happens. It has happened repeatedly, and it is one of the ways that military organizations actually function. They function not as purely hierarchical structures, but as organizations that make decisions based on the information they have and the judgments they make about the situation they face. When the information is good and the judgment is sound, the organization acts. When the civilian hierarchy is slow, the military acts. And when the action is correct, the civilian hierarchy catches up eventually and makes the same decision that the military has already made. The cable from Whitehall arrived at Hereford on September 14th. The response from Hereford was brief and non-committal. The order would be obeyed. The operation would be concluded. But it had already been concluded. The withdrawal was complete. The personnel were out. The operation was finished. The civilian leadership could issue whatever orders it wanted to issue. The matter had already been resolved by the military hierarchy. And the response from Hereford said, in the language of military communication, that the matter was closed. That was the message. That was the statement. And it was delivered not through any elaborate explanation, but through the simple fact of silence.